Okay, so we want to really get a grasp on what's at stake in this 2024 election. Not just like who's ahead in the polls right now, but what the world might actually look like depending on who wins.
Hmm.
What's the point of all this if we don't use it to think about the future? So we're taking a deep dive into election 2024 alternate futures. And to do that, we're using this method called culture mapping.
Culture mapping is about analyzing the future, and we do that by looking at today's emerging trends and subcultures.
Okay, so we're going beyond just looking at the headlines and digging into the motivations and the desires of specific groups. Why is that so important?
Well, because these subcultures are often dismissed as like niche or fringe groups, but they can be incredibly powerful indicators of future trends.
Mm.
They're often the ones who are pioneering the ideas and the behaviors that eventually become much more mainstream. Think about the early adopters of things like organic food or electric cars.
Right.
They were once a small minority, but their choices signaled a much larger shift in consumer values.
So how can we use culture mapping to understand what might happen after the 2024 election?
So, Election 2024 Alternate Futures lays out four distinct scenarios: gradual evolution, survival mode, transformation, and balanced adaptation.
Yeah.
Each scenario explores how different subcultures might influence the future based on who wins the presidency.
Okay, so let's start with gradual evolution. What defines this particular future?
So, this scenario assumes a certain level of stability and continuity. We're talking about incremental progress on issues like sustainability, privacy, and social justice.
Okay.
Think of it as a slow and steady shift in the right direction.
And who are the key players driving this gradual evolution?
Groups like what the report calls green consumers, who prioritize environmentally friendly products, minimalists, who are pushing back against consumerism, and privacy advocates, who are demanding greater control over their data.
So these subcultures are already influencing brand choices and policy decisions, and you're saying their influence is likely to grow. Can you give us some concrete examples of how brands might respond to these evolving values in a gradual evolution scenario?
Absolutely. We could see brands adopting more sustainable packaging, reducing their carbon footprint, and being more transparent about their data practices.
Okay.
But it's not just about making these superficial changes. It's about really embedding these values into the core of their business models.
So authenticity is key. Consumers are becoming increasingly savvy and can spot greenwashing a mile away. But this gradual evolution scenario, it probably plays out differently depending on whether Trump or Harris wins, right?
Absolutely. This scenario is considered far more likely under a Harris presidency.
Okay.
Her focus on incremental policy changes really aligns with the core tenets of this future.
In other words, her stated commitment to investing in renewable energy and supporting small businesses speaks directly to the values of these green consumers and those interested in a more equitable economy.
Right.
We even see that reflected in her statements about building an opportunity economy, which suggests a focus on sustainable and inclusive growth.
Exactly. Her approach is all about fostering collaboration and consensus building, which are crucial for navigating the complexities of climate change and economic inequality.
On the other hand, the report suggests that this type of gradual, consensus-driven approach is less likely under a second Trump administration.
That's right. His statement suggests a preference for more disruptive and immediate action.
Okay.
For instance, his focus on renegotiating trade deals and reducing immigration aligns with the desire to quickly shift the existing order, potentially disrupting the kind of collaboration and long-term planning needed for a gradual evolution scenario.
So while gradual evolution sees some positive trends, its likelihood hinges on a leader who embraces those values and governs accordingly. What happens if things take a turn for the worse? That's where our next scenario, survival mode, comes in, and we'll dive into that right after this.
So survival mode paints a very different picture. Imagine a world grappling with a major crisis, like an economic collapse, global conflict, or a climate disaster. This scenario really explores what happens when our focus shifts from long-term progress to immediate survival.
So instead of embracing change, it's more about hunkering down and weathering the storm. What impact would this have on those subcultures that we were just discussing?
Well, in a survival mode scenario, the priorities of these niche subcultures often take a backseat to those more immediate concerns, like basic needs.
Right.
When people are worried about putting food on the table, that push for things like data privacy or sustainable consumption might lose a bit of its momentum.
Yeah, because who cares about having their data controlled when you're worried about putting food on the table?
Exactly. But it's important to note that some subcultures, often dismissed as those fringe groups, might actually gain prominence in this kind of environment.
Right.
Preppers, for example, who prioritize self-sufficiency and preparedness, could see their values resonate with a much broader audience. Crypto-anarchists advocating for decentralized systems and individual sovereignty might also find a much larger audience.
So while some subcultures fade into the background, others, particularly those focused on self-reliance and resilience, could rise in influence. How would this survival mode mentality affect policy decisions in this scenario?
We could see governments prioritizing short-term economic stability over those long-term sustainability goals.
Interesting.
We could even see a rollback of environmental regulations, a shift towards protectionist trade policies, and a greater emphasis on national security.
It sounds like it would be a world where anxieties run high and the focus shifts towards maintaining order and control. How would brands adapt to this new reality?
In a survival mode scenario, brands might face pressure to prioritize affordability and availability over sustainability or ethical sourcing. Imagine brands streamlining their supply chains, cutting costs, and focusing on those really essential products.
So not exactly a recipe for innovation or social responsibility. Now, when we look at the two candidates through the lens of this survival mode scenario, how do they measure up?
The report suggests that this kind of scenario, while certainly not inevitable, is more likely under a second Trump administration.
What points to that conclusion?
His rhetoric often centers on a message of decline and the need for this drastic action to kind of restore America's past glory. He often uses phrases like, "Our country is being lost," "We're a failing nation." And this framing, whether intentional or not, creates this sense of urgency and fear, which can be fertile ground for a survival mode mentality to take hold.
And his proposed solutions like tariffs and stricter immigration policies do seem to reflect a more reactive us versus them approach, which might exacerbate anxieties rather than fostering collaboration and long-term thinking.
Precisely. And even his statement, what they have done to our country by allowing these millions and millions of people to come into our country reinforces this sense of scarcity and external threat, which can make it very challenging to address those really complex interconnected issues like climate change or economic inequality.
Whereas Harris, with her focus on things like long-term sustainability and social justice, doesn't quite fit that mold.
Exactly. Her statement about building an opportunity economy, for example, suggests a more optimistic outlook and a focus on those long-term solutions rather than these immediate reactive measures.
Okay.
However, it's worth noting that even under a Harris administration, unexpected global events could still push us towards a survival mode scenario, highlighting the importance of being prepared for a range of potential futures.
So survival mode presents a sort of cautionary tale. It reminds us that progress is not inevitable and that external shocks can easily derail even the best laid plans. But let's shift gears now and explore a more radical vision of the future. Transformation. What can you tell us about this scenario? Transformation. It feels like we're moving from a world of cautious steps to one of giant leaps.
That's a good way to put it. Transformation imagines a future where we don't just adapt to change, we actively shape it. It's a world driven by a desire for radical progress on issues like sustainability, social justice, and technological advancement.
So instead of incremental improvements, we're talking about a fundamental shift in values and priorities. Who are the key drivers of this transformation?
This scenario sees the rise of what the report calls disruptive subcultures. These are groups like biohackers who are pushing the boundaries of human potential through technology, data libertarians who are advocating for radical transparency and individual control over data, and eco-warriors who are demanding immediate and decisive action on climate change.
So these groups, often relegated to the fringes, actually become central to shaping the future in this scenario.
Exactly. Their ideas, once considered fringe or radical, start to resonate with a much larger segment of society. And concepts like zero-carbon economy, personalized medicine, and these decentralized self-governing online communities become not just thinkable, but actually desirable.
It sounds like a future defined by both tremendous possibility and potential upheaval. How would this transformation scenario impact the way governments operate?
We could see a dramatic shift in policy priorities. Imagine governments investing heavily in renewable energy infrastructure, implementing a universal basic income, and enacting strict regulations on data privacy and artificial intelligence.
So bold moves and a willingness to challenge the status quo. What about brands? How would they navigate this radically transformed landscape?
In a transformation scenario, brands would need to become agents of change, not just providers of products or services.
Okay.
Imagine companies embracing radical transparency in their supply chains, prioritizing ethical sourcing and manufacturing, and collaborating with consumers to create truly sustainable consumption models.
It sounds like authenticity and a commitment to social responsibility would be non-negotiable.
Exactly.
Consumers would demand it, and those who fail to adapt would be left behind.
Precisely. In this scenario, brands would need to demonstrate a genuine commitment to the values of this transformed society, not just pay lip service to them. Now, when we look at the two candidates through the lens of transformation, the report suggests that this scenario is more aligned with a Harris presidency.
Why is that?
Her emphasis on innovation progress and social justice really resonates with the core values of this scenario. For example, her support for green energy, small business innovation, and investment in education and technology really aligns with this idea of using policy to drive positive change.
And her statement about building an economy that works for everyone, not just those at the top, also seems to reflect a commitment to the kind of equitable future envisioned in this scenario.
Exactly. Her approach, which emphasizes collaboration and inclusion, seems well suited to navigating the complexities and potential disruptions of a transformation scenario.
What about Trump? Where does he fit into this vision of a radically transformed future?
The report suggests that this scenario is less likely under a second Trump administration.
Because his focus seems to be more on restoring a version of the past than really embracing a radically different future.
That's a key observation. His statements tend to emphasize those more traditional values, economic nationalism, and a desire to return to a time of perceived greatness. This perspective, while appealing to some, might not resonate as strongly in a world seeking rapid and fundamental change.
So transformation, while potentially disruptive, offers a vision of a future defined by progress, innovation, and a commitment to creating a more just and sustainable world. However, the likelihood of achieving this vision depends largely on the leadership and policies we choose today.
That's an important takeaway. Transformation is not a preordained outcome. It requires a conscious effort to challenge these existing systems and embrace new ways of thinking and doing.
Which brings us to our final scenario, balanced adaptation. What can you tell us about this path?
Balanced adaptation explores the possibility of finding a middle ground between preserving the best of the past and embracing the possibilities of the future.
So a more measured approach, perhaps less disruptive than transformation, but still focused on progress.
Precisely. This scenario recognizes that we don't have to choose between tradition and innovation, between continuity and change. It's about finding ways to blend the two to create a future that's both sustainable and stable.
Okay, so paint a picture for me. What does this balance look like in practice?
Imagine a world where governments invest in renewable energy while also supporting workers in those transitioning industries, where brands prioritize sustainability without compromising affordability, where technological innovation goes hand in hand with ethical considerations and data privacy.
So it's about finding those win-win solutions, those policies and practices that move us forward without leaving anyone behind.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging that progress doesn't have to come at the expense of stability, and that we can create a better future without completely dismantling the systems and structures of the past.
And who is best positioned to lead us towards this balanced adaptation?
The report is very clear on this point. Balanced adaptation aligns most closely with a Harris presidency.
Her emphasis on collaboration, finding common ground, and pursuing progress in a measured and sustainable way seems very well suited to this scenario.
Precisely. Her statement, "I believe very strongly that the American people want a president who understands the importance of bringing us together, knowing we have so much more in common than what separates us," reflects a commitment to unity and balance, which are crucial ingredients for navigating the complexities of this scenario.
Whereas Trump, with his more divisive rhetoric and tendency towards unilateral action, might find it more challenging to navigate this delicate balancing act.
That's a valid point. His statements often highlight a more adversarial approach focusing on strength dominance and a willingness to challenge those perceived enemies, which might make it more difficult to find common ground and build consensus.
So balanced adaptation presents this hopeful vision of the future one where progress and stability go hand in hand. But achieving this balance requires a leader who can bridge divides, foster collaboration, and navigate the complexities of a rapidly changing world.
Indeed, balanced adaptation reminds us that the future is not predetermined. It's shaped by the choices we make today. And by understanding the forces at play, the trends emerging, and the subcultures influencing our trajectory, we can make more informed decisions both in the voting booth and in our daily lives to create the future we want.
If you're interested in learning more about culture mapping and how to apply this powerful tool to your own industry or organization, reach out to the experts at Culture Mapping at scenarioDNA.com. They can provide you with the insights and guidance you need to navigate the complexities of our rapidly changing world and make more informed decisions about the future.